Elena, thank you. I wanted to thank all of you for being here this evening, and I wanted to thank Sylvia Fantoni and Megan Douglas for inviting me to have this virtual studio visit with the Newark Museum of Art, and Imani Lee Hector for your work behind the scenes with all of the technical ins and outs. And a special thank you to Dexter Wemberly, who is the founder of the Hayama residency. It's the residency's partnership with the Newark Museum of Art that brings me here tonight. What I'm going to do is share some images of paintings and site-specific works that I've done in the past, and then switch over to the iPad and share my studio with you this evening. Imani, can we have the first slide, please? This is a picture of the carriage house that I work out of. So this is, I'm inside of that building right now, and we can go to the next slide. And this is a picture of a painting that I made over 30 years ago. The reason I'm sharing this painting with you this evening, even though it's so different than the work I do today, is that it's really become a touch point for me. It's a painting that I made in my senior year in college. And when I look back at it, I can see some common threads with the work that I do now. So the way I made this painting was not the easiest way possible. When I look back on it, I ask myself, why didn't I just take a snapshot of my hands cupping water and paint from the photograph? But instead, the way I made this was I stood in my studio with a bowl of water, and I cupped the water in my hands and watched it seep out between my fingers, and focused on the sensation of cupping the water and the water disappearing between my fingers. And I did that over and over again. And in between sort of all the water coming out from my hands, I would work on the painting, and then I would cup more water. So when I look at this painting, I think about my interest in the sensation and my interest in the labor, meaning that I didn't take the quickest route, that I took the right path, but it wasn't the easiest path. And also that I was trying to capture something that was fleeting, a fleeting moment. So we can go to the next slide now. About 30 years later, I made this painting on the wall in the Phillips collection. So this is an image of a wall drawing that I made called At the Time Being in 2010. And it was part of the Phillips Collection's program called Intersections, where I invite contemporary artists to come into the museum and make work in response to their permanent collection. So I chose to respond to the Van Gogh painting that you can see hanging between the two archways. And that piece is called The Road Menders, and it was painted in 1889. Next slide, please. So this is the finished piece from inside the gallery. And one of the particular qualities of this piece was that visitors needed to move through the space in order to see the work in its entirety. So they could glimpse portions of the wall drawing from outside of the gallery, but then they were drawn into the space in order to see the piece as a whole. So this is, the ceilings are about 10 feet high, and I think the wall is about 24 feet wide. Next slide, please. So this is just another angle of the same piece. One of the things about the wall drawings is that they are all designed or conceived around the architecture of the spaces in which they exist. They're also all temporary. Next slide, please. So their expiration date, so to speak, is predetermined. Like any exhibition, there's a a beginning and an end. And at the end of these wall drawing exhibitions, the works are painted over. In the case of the Phillips collection, that was a museum that has an amazing permanent collection, the Van Gogh being a perfect example. And so the juxtaposition between the preservation of these important works of art and the ephemerality of the wall drawings, what that relationship was magnified in that particular space. Next slide, please. So the wall drawings are drawn on the wall in the gallery, and I do a lot of preparatory work prior to beginning installation. But I don't work on a computer, and I don't transfer any preparatory drawings onto the wall to begin. So these are two small works that I made as I was planning that piece in the months coming up to the actual installation. And you can see some similarities, but you also see the difference between the small works and the final piece. Next slide, please. This is another one of my site-specific works. This was at the Hayama Museum in 2011. And the wall that you're looking at is about 22 or 23 feet high. If you look on the lower left there, you can see an exit door to give you a sense of scale. Next slide. So this is just another view of the same piece. I worked on this inside the museum for about 12 days, working 14 or 15 hours a day. But prior to that, I worked on preparatory drawings scaled to the space in the studio for a few months, and also color studies. Next slide, please. And so this is just to give you a sense of the scale. That circle down at the bottom is about 2.5 or 3 feet in diameter. Next slide, please. And this is the last wall drawing that I'll share with you this evening. This was at the Hirschhorn Museum. It was on view from, I think, May 2016 through the fall of 2017. And the title of the piece was Our View from Here. The wall drawings all have titles, but my individual paintings are all untitled. And the reason for that is that I like to title my exhibitions. And if I title an exhibition that is just the wall drawing, that becomes the title of the wall drawing. So if that makes any sense to you. Anyhow, so for those of you that have never been to the Hirschhorn Museum, it's a donut-shaped building that was designed by Gordon Bunshaft, and the piece that I did in the space was in response to that architecture. So the drawing that you see here is just a small portion of a circular piece that goes all the way around inside of the museum. Next slide, please. So this is just a short video. The beginning of it is a time lapse that represents, I think, about 64 hours of work, which is the time that I spent on the first section of wall. And the entire piece is made up of 8 sections. Each section is between 50 and 55 feet long. And I think we're gonna kind of skip through this a little bit so that it just gives you a sense of traveling through the space. Part of the reason for the title, Our View from Here, related to the architecture and the way in which one could not perceive the entire piece by standing in one space, that your view of it changed depending on where you were inside of the museum. So that piece took me 65 consecutive days to complete. But prior to beginning the installation, I made dozens of small scale preparatory drawings. And this is an example of 4 of them. So what I did was I made many of them and sorted through them and eventually came up with the final 8 preparatory drawings that were the basis for the installation that I made. So as I mentioned before, I don't work on a computer, but what I do with the wall drawings from time to time is I'll take the scaled preparatory drawings, scan them, and then use CAD to identify the geometry that the drawings grow out of. And you'll begin to understand a little bit more about that, hopefully, as I share more of my work with you. Next slide, please. So this is one of the scaled preparatory drawings on the bottom of the slide, and then the resulting wall drawing at the top. So you can see that there are similarities, but also differences. And one of the obvious differences is the gesture. So that drawing at the bottom is only 4 inches tall. So the gesture the gestures in it were a result of my wrist and my hand. Whereas the installation on the top of the slide was made with my whole body. And so of course it has a very different feeling to it. Okay, next slide, please. This is just a view of the piece from the inside of the donut-shaped Hirschhorn Museum at night. So you can get a sense of the way that it traveled around the architecture. Next slide. And people always ask me what tools I use to make these pieces. And so in the case of the Hirschhorn project, I used this, it's basically a graffiti marker. You can buy them in any art supply store. And they come without any ink or paint inside of them. And then I fill them with my own acrylic inks. And that little block that I'm holding between my fingers is actually the felt tip of the magic marker. So the felt tip is replaceable. So I can fill the marker up as many times as I need to. And then as the tip gets worn down by the tooth of the wall, I can replace that so that I can control the quality of line. Next slide, please. So this is just a short video of the piece getting painted over. Amani, are you able to hit play on that? Oh, I guess we skipped, did we skip that slide? Let's see. Okay, I just wanted to play this because, when I explain to people that the wall drawings are impermanent, they often don't understand what I actually mean by that. So all of the wall drawings that I make are temporary. And when the exhibitions come to a close, they're painted over and they'll never be seen again. Of course, I have great documentation of them. This is a piece that I did at the Bowdoin Museum of Art in 2018. It's called Let's Get Lost. And this is a detail of the gallery space, which was an oval-shaped gallery. And it's split into 4 walls, and each of the walls had an 8-foot niche, like the one that you see in this image. And so each of the compositions, each of the 4 compositions that made up the entire piece, sort of emanated from that architectural feature, from that niche. I'm just showing you one detail of this, but what I will say is that there was a second element to this exhibition, which was a collaborative piece called Listening Glass. And I made that with 3 other artists, Rebecca Bray, Josh Knowles, and James Garber. And it was a sound project. I think we have a slide of, a slide. Thank you. So that's Rebecca demonstrating Listening Glass. And what we did with that project, with that collaborative project, was we turned the oval-shaped gallery and the wall drawing, Let's Get Lost, into a giant instrument. And visitors to the gallery could download the app, the iPhone app called Listening Glass, onto their own iPhones, or they could borrow an iPhone from the museum and go into the gallery and basically play the drawing. And this was something that you could do on your own, or you could do it with other visitors collaboratively. The gestures that one would use with that handheld device were making reference to the gestures that I used as I made the drawing. So there was a way of sort of bringing that collaborative project back to my individual work as the artist who did the wall drawing. And if anybody's interested, but the app is still available on the App Store for iPhones. And obviously it was built for that particular project, but you can use it on other things too, and it's kind of fun. So the image that you're seeing now is a graph paper drawing. And I've been making this series of graph paper drawings since around 2007. Originally, they began as a way for me to continue work while I was traveling. So to be able to work on a small scale as I was traveling and making kind of preparatory sketches for larger works when I came back into the studio. But over time, they've become a body of work unto themselves. And sometimes they do end up leading to larger works. And sometimes when I'm beginning a larger work, I'll go back and do graph paper drawings to explore some ideas and kind of narrow down a beginning point. But as you'll see, oftentimes, even if I think I'm taking a graph paper drawing and using it as a preparatory work, the larger piece that results doesn't really resemble what I started with. So this piece is 10 inches by 8 inches. And if you could go to the next slide. This is the painting that I made following that preparatory drawing. So the painting is 41 inches by 33 inches. And really the only element that is common between them, besides the mark making approach, is that central sphere. So originally when I took that small drawing and used it as a model for a painting, I expected that there would be, that they would resemble one another more. But in the end, this is what I ended up with. And I finished this piece at the end of 2020. As I mentioned earlier, my paintings are untitled, but I sometimes have private titles for them, ways that I refer to them, often just in my own head. And this piece I refer to as my wrecking ball painting. So it was, following that very difficult first year of the pandemic. Next slide. So this slide will begin to bring us into the studio visit portion of this evening. This is a large painting that I'll show you the progression of the piece, and then I'll show you the finished painting here in the studio. So each of these panels is 78 inches tall, and together combined, they're 11 feet wide. What you see is the first layer of paint as I was just beginning the painting. So can we go to the next slide, please? So the first thing that I did was I hung a string across the two panels to create a catenary curve. And then I traced that curve with a pencil, but what you're seeing here is actually not the pencil, it's the marks that I made on that pencil line. And it's too hard for you to really see in the slide, but you'll get a better sense of the quality of the mark when I take you into the studio. Next slide, please. So this was probably a couple weeks into the project, and you can see that the image is beginning to grow across the surface of the painting. So that what you're seeing there that kind of resembles a curtain is actually many little dots that are applied to the surface in a grid-like fashion. But because I'm making those marks with the sort of the imperfections of my own body, the grid is very imperfect. And the further I move away from that initial line, the more imperfect that grid becomes. Next slide, please. So you can see how the grid begins to bunch and spread and kind of collapse into itself in certain areas. So this is all done with just the blue background and then this one warm white color that I was making the marks with. Next slide, please. So at this point, I guess I was unsatisfied with the graphic qualities of the painting, and I came into the studio and mixed a big pot of dark blue ink and did a wash across the whole surface there. Next slide, please. So I was unsatisfied with the quality of that curve and the harshness of it. So oops, we're going backwards. In the next slide, you'll see that a couple more slides forward, please. One more. That I filled in the top there. So I added more of those little marks up above that original curve, and then I painted over those as well so that they would meld with the entire surface. But the thing that I was finding unsatisfying was the softness of the image that was developing. And I was at this point trying to figure out how to add an element that had more architectural quality to it. So one of the things that I did was that framing element around the top and the two sides that you see, that gray framing element. Okay, next slide. So when at the point at which I had gotten the painting to that last point, I came down with COVID. So I had that little snapshot on my phone, and I went home and I was stuck there, not feeling well for about 5 days, and kind of contemplating how I could bring more architecture into the painting. And so when I got back into the studio, I added those lines. I kind of refer to them as bars. And if you go to the next slide, you'll see that I brought them onto both panels and then began to rework the surface so that that new element could become unified with the rest of the painting that I had already established. Next slide, please. In this image, you can see that I've painted that framing device white. So it had been gray. I continued to work on the surface and adding more color and differentiating areas. But that framing section was still giving me a lot of trouble. Next slide, please. So here you can see that I painted it black and actually added a layer of gloss finish on top of the black. And what is a little difficult to see in this picture is that each of those bars is kind of notched into the framing device. So I think that's the last slide that I have of this painting. Is that right? Okay, I think I'm gonna switch to the iPad now. I'll try not to make this too bumpy. Can you guys hear and see everything okay?
Everything looks great, Lynn.
Great, thank you. So this is the finished painting. And what I ended up doing after so much trouble with that area around the edges was I sanded the entire thing down. So I'm gonna try and go in and see if I can show this to you. in more detail. But the edges are now just raw wood. And here you can see the grid that I spoke of earlier. Okay, so my guess is that there might be some questions about that piece, but before we get to that, I'll just show you the rest of my studio. So this is a big painting that I just started a few days ago. I'm actually on my way out to California next week for a residency out there. So I'm gonna roll this up and bring it along with me. And these are some smaller paintings that I started making during the pandemic when things were in such upheaval. It was a little bit too difficult to dive into larger works. This is a piece that I just finished.
That's incredible. The detail is so fine.
Thank you. And the paintings that you saw behind me earlier. Okay, so do we want to switch back to the laptop? How would you like to?
Would you like to do that for the Q&A?
Sure.
Okay. So we have a number of questions already in the chat, and just a reminder, if you have any questions, please feel free to add them to the Q&A feature. So Lynn, there's obviously a lot of enthusiasm for your work. It's so beautiful and so immersive. So one of the first questions that we had is, if possible, could you talk a little bit more about that first slide of your early work and how it relates to your work now, like what the connection is between the two?
Sure. So, at one point while I was working on what I'm calling the framing device on this newest large work, I was trying something out, which I didn't even end up taking a picture of along the way because I abandoned it pretty quickly. But as I was working, I was very aware of how attached I am to process. And when I look at that painting that I made in 1990, I see all of that laid out before me. I mean, obviously, there's such a giant difference in the, I guess you could say the goals. Like in that painting, I was trying to make something that resembled the world that we live in a really concrete way. But my approach to doing it was not dissimilar to the work that I do now. So this kind of attachment to labor and dedication to my practice, and also my interest in physicality. So all of my work is so physical. I mean, I mentioned that that iPhone app called Listening Glass, that when visitors to the Bowdoin Museum of Art used that, they ended up kind of replicating my gesture that I used to make the drawing. So, and that was very intentional. And so it's the gesture, the physicality, the kind of pressing myself to my limits. So for instance, working 65 consecutive days at Hirschhorn was not just a stunt, it was it was sort of a demonstration of the way that I am in this world, and specifically the way that I am with my work in this world. So I think I answered the question. Oh.
Yeah, and that's a really interesting way to frame it, to frame the connection between those two works. So
I mean,
thank you.
I'll add that one of the reasons that one of many reasons that I don't work in that representative fashion anymore is that I'm really invested in this idea of ambiguity. And for me, abstraction is the way to get to that place. And it's a way that I can surprise myself over and over again. Although when I look at my own collection at home, most of what I own is not abstract. Most of the work that I own is representational.
Oh, interesting.
Well, I don't really think of my work as abstract. I mean, I know it's read that way, but the way that I make it is, I don't enter it that way. I enter it through my process, which is very physical and concrete.
No, that makes sense. So another question that we have that I think you kind of touched on, but I don't know if you want to elaborate on is, do you work freehand or with some kind of stenciling device? And describe, I guess, how you recreate your smaller scale drawings on the wall when you create your murals.
So I don't use any stenciling device. For the sake of brevity, I didn't share all of the different process pictures that I have from the Hirschhorn. But one of the things that we did with that project and with other projects is we used a giant compass. So some of the circles that were kind of embedded in those preparatory drawings were then transferred onto the wall to create a very particular and pre-planned geometry that then drove the way that the compositions evolved. So that's the thing that gets transferred when I'm working on that very large scale, is some very basic geometry. But beyond that, it's all free.
Gotcha. So somebody asked, why does your work not have any titles?
So I prefer not to title any of the work, but as I said, I realized that when I titled exhibitions that were wall drawings, the title of the exhibition became the title of the wall drawing. The reason I avoid titles of my paintings is that I don't want to narrow them. So, with non-representational work, people come to it and see, in some ways it can become like a Rorschach. And I'd rather leave that open to the viewer so that they can bring to it whatever it is that they bring to it, rather than instructing them as to what they should see in the piece. I mean, I shared something tonight with the audience, that sort of private title that I gave to that painting. But if that were on a label on the wall with the painting and it said wrecking ball, it would narrow the ways that the painting could be understood or read. And I'd rather people come at it with their own interpretation and then possibly see a wall label that would add an additional layer of meaning for them.
That makes sense. So it's kind of leaving it open for the viewer.
Yes.
Another question we have, or it's a comment and a question, and there were a few people that had this saying, Lynn, your art is truly amazing and beautiful. It reminds me of the warping of time and space. What inspires these designs? So
inspiration is a really tricky question. It's not a one-to-one for me. I try to come to the work with an open mind and sort of receive what the paintings are telling me as they evolve. So actually this evening before we got started, I was working on a small preparatory drawing. I can show it to you actually. Hold on one second. So how to explain this? This painting behind me, this one here, it actually began with an ellipse. And so the marks that I made started by tracing an ellipse, and then the composition evolved from that point, moving inward and outward in that grid-like pattern that I work in. And so the new big painting that you saw, that canvas tacked to the wall, I'm trying to figure out how I'm going to approach that piece. And I'm thinking about possibly starting it in the same manner, but I'm unsure of myself, and those big paintings take months to make. So, you know, I'd rather have a little bit of an idea about it before I dive in. So I started this little graph paper drawing, and it started out with an ellipse that you can kind of see in here, like that.
Mm-hmm.
But it was unsatisfying, and so I ended up covering part of it with that, with this darker circle. So that's just an example of like responding to the way that that a composition evolves, and that the compositions evolve based on the drawing technique or painting technique that I'm using, and then to try and sort of not have a set idea in my mind, but listen to the painting as it changes and grows, and respond to that.
Nice. All right. Well, thank you for that. And we have time for one last question. So unfortunately, I cannot get to everybody's questions, but this last one is, what inspired you to change from using continuous lines to dots and small circles?
So it's going to be hard to answer that quickly, but I had worked with this dot making, or like, I don't know what to call it, like dot technique. I don't know what to use, but I had worked with this approach many years ago.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things that's interesting about process is that, you know, you as you use a certain process over and over again, you become more familiar with it, and also your technique improves. And so what might have originally been kind of wobbly becomes more stable. And it's the wobbliness that might be the thing that creates more interest in the paintings. Like a lot of times I think that it's really, you know, people will talk about the precision in my work, and it's really the imprecision or the mistakes, if you want to call them that I'm dependent on for the way that the images evolve. So at a certain point, I had stopped using that mark making technique. I think at the time I felt like it had become too still. And in 2016, after I finished the Hirschhorn project, I was wiped out and I needed a break, and I also needed to change some things up in the studio. And so one of the things that I did was I went back to the dots and took a break from the lines. Now, since then, I have made paintings that were line-based, and sometimes I mix the two things together a bit. But for whatever reason, right now, this is I'm finding that there's like a depth of unknown territory to explore with this approach. So I'm gonna keep at it until I run out of new ideas.
Perfect. That's great. Well, thank you so much, Lynn. I'm so sorry I can't get to the other questions. But I could talk to you all night. It was just so interesting getting to see your work and getting to hear more about your process. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Elena. Thank you.
So you can learn more about Lynn at her website. And Amani has also put it in the chat. So in case you would like to just directly go right to Lynn's website, please do so. And we do have some upcoming on-site exhibitions. So thank you so much for joining us for this virtual event, but we do have some on-site programs that you can join us at. So join us this Friday, the 25th at 7 p.m. for a film and panel, Why Is We Americans, about Newark's own Baraka family. The Eventbrite to register for this free event is in the chat. So thank you, Amani, for that. We also have an Art After Dark event happening on March 10th at 7 p.m. So feel free to join us for this street art face-off by getting tickets at our website. And have a wonderful evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us.